Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Sayeda Rukshida. It's an honor to welcome all of you. I'm the Honorary Secretary of Indian Association of Biological Psychiatry. Welcome to the First Friday CME web series, which is curated especially for our psychiatrists, young, old, and however they identify. This is freely available even later on YouTube. We live stream it on our Facebook page as well. You can join us via Zoom, or you can join us, you can see us there. And if anybody has any questions and comments, please leave it in the chat. Then we could go on with it. Today, just a little while ago, Dr. Prasad Rao sir was saying that this is our last year. So it's especially special for us. At this point, may I please request everybody to keep their audios on mute so that it's easier for us to conduct our webinar. And thank you very much. At this point, just before we start, we all have with us today the luminaries and stalwarts of psychiatry on the panel today. And I would please request Dr. G. Prasad Rao, sir, who's our past president of IABP, who continues to be our guiding force and the CME of the scientific program of Indian Association of Biological Psychiatry, to moderate this session and take over. So please.
Yeah. Thanks. First of all, it's my pleasure to be with all of you today. It's always a pleasure to have a great faculty in Indian Association of Biological Psychiatry under the energies of our respectable Ruksheda Saida, who is our Honorary Secretary General. She is a very, you can say, organized and very systematic. And of course, she keeps giving me energy to work like this. In a tired day, of course. And Fridays, we except last month because of the festivals and all, and the other conferences we didn't have. Otherwise, we had quite regularly webinar conferences, part of the biological psychiatry. I hope some of you have been watching this. And this time, we chose very consciously that we'll choose a topic which everyone thinks they know. Everyone thinks they know quite well, but the role and actual practice, I would say from the lab to the bedside clinical practice, is something which needs a fine tuning. As I said, everyone knows something, and I was just going through the market of nutraceuticals. I would call it nutraceuticals. This is a very, very large, and you will be surprised, it is about 7,500 crore market. Some is organized by pharma company, and quite a lot is available on the web. Amazon, and varieties of other things sell this. And a very brief take before I think the chairperson should have their due. It's again pleasure to see both Sunil Mittal back. Last time he couldn't attend, he was partially there. Sunil's presence actually makes the meeting much more, I would say, sober. He comes out with an expert comments in the end, and quite well. And my dear friend Pramod Kumar, Jagdisha, and of course Radhika and Malai. I have a special word for both of them, Radhika and Malai, who are joining as a faculty for the first time here. Malai is a very serious biological psychiatrist. When I say serious, if you ask him something, he goes to the precise detail and communicates quite well. Welcome, Malai. And Radhika has been my younger colleague for quite some time. I think I did teach her once or twice while she was a student in Tirupati, if she remembers that. But beyond that, Radhika is now a leader of the Professor of Psychiatry. So we welcome all of you. So without much ado, I think we chose topics, and surely this would be interesting. As you see, the members are joining one after other, and I know it's going to be a great seminar. So over to you, Rukshada.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Sunil Mittal, he's our Senior Vice President, President-elect of Indian Association of Biological Psychiatry. If I could please invite him to share a few welcoming words for all of us. Dr. Mittal, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Rukshada. It's a pleasure being here on the first Friday CME series, and like you said, it's very well curated. It's always tough to speak after, even for 2 minutes after Prasad Rao, who's thought of these topics. And then before such an eminent group of speakers like Malay, who's going to come and speak, and Jagdisha, and of course the two chairpersons, Pramod and Dr. Radhika Reddy. So it's a tough job, these 2 minutes, but all the same, well, like I said, that we are what we eat. And we think, we feel what we eat. So a lot of interest, like we all know, has been in nutrition. Our great grandparents used to say, eat this, don't eat that, parhez kya hai, kya mat khao, etc. But of course, now we have evidence and science to help us along this way. Like Dr. Prasad Rao said, that everybody thinks they seem to know about it, but we're still learning. Because when we talk about nutritional psychiatry, the epidemiological data, is there. Somewhat there, but you don't know what is the cause-effect relationship. Then we don't have the well-powered studies. I mean, the experimental models, the methodological limitations which exist in nutritional psychiatry. There is a lot of data, information which is available. And the progress in this direction is going to require evidence, which requires very organized, methodologically sound, mechanistic studies. And then, of course, you look at the biological processes, the molecular processes that may be involved. Only then you can actually talk about it. But now, of course, the other side is that we can talk about the spices, we can talk about the carbohydrates, we can talk about high protein diets, we can talk about our own kicks that we get from food, various foods. But then also we can also talk about the omega-3 rich fish, etc. But to actually have a sort of an evidence for a heterogeneous population across a lifespan, because nutritional needs change. What I required at 14, at my age, I can't even digest that, what I required at 14. So those things have been happening. And then, of course, the genetic predispositions and the genes, the nutrigenomics bit to it, the prebiotics, the probiotics, and the gut biome. What we eat determines our gut biome, and that we know controls the production of serotonin in the gut and how it upregulates, downregulates our moods and neurons. For the last few years, I've been advising a company which has been dealing with genomics, along with, of course, the application. And we work with some of our patients who had bad bipolar disease, who had other mood disorders, essentially mood disorders. We have not looked at other things. And then looking at, of course, you have the MIND diet, the Mediterranean DASH, international approach, etc., for neurodegenerative delay, the MIND diet or the DASH diets. And we looked at some of the genes, the methylation genes, the clock genes, the inflammatory genes that govern inflammatory processes, and trying to interpret them through a whole lot of almost 123 genes that were associated with nutritional intake and performance. And we did modify things. We got people to have their skin better, but we still couldn't get the right diets to actually bring down any dosage in the principal psychiatric conditions they were consulting us for, because that's what they hoped. We didn't hope for it. We thought, let's see how we go along. Lifestyle modification that accompanies diets did help. But we have experts today evening to talk about this. So this is just to say that here are the opening remarks from me. It's an extremely important topic. It's a very exciting area of work. And I think there is a long road ahead. We are just beginning to traverse that. So over to you, Rukshada, and over to the eminent speakers that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. G. Prasad Rao, would you please introduce the chairs and invite them?
Yeah. See, it's again a formality. All of us know the eminent chairpersons today without much ado. But at the same time, it is our responsibility when we call them to chair the session. We'll start with Radhika Reddy first, the younger one. to begin with. And of course, Rukshida always smiles when I introduce ladies first. And that's how I'm going. And Radhika, Professor Radhika, has had her undergraduation and post-graduation in psychiatry from the famous SV Medical College. You can watch, I can watch for you. Those who graduate from SV Medical College are usually great guys. And she's one of the great guys. She's a leader. She has been the past president of Indian Psychiatric Society, I think Andhra Pradesh. But more than that, she has done a wonderful service in the last 2.5 years. When the Samanvi was started in the South Zone IPS, she was the chairperson, and we had a lot of beautiful interactions about women-related psychological issues. So Radhika is nicely married and has 2 daughters. One daughter is already married, and her husband is an engineer, very brilliant engineer. So this is about Radhika, and she has contributed quite significantly. She's a faculty member. The other chairperson is, I think, is a well-known, famous person from the Indian Psychiatric Society, Indian Institution of Private Psychiatry, and Indian Institution of Biological Psychiatry, Dr. Pramod Kumar. He has been the Secretary General of IAPP, and he currently is also, he has been a past Vice President of IABP as well. Again, a senior clinician from Chandigarh, and significantly contributed for the movements of private psychiatry and biological psychiatry. So without much ado, I invite both of them for their comments, and then the faculty will be introduced.
Okay. Dr. Radhika, thank you, Dr. Jaiprashad Rao. And so may I take, please confirm my audible status and the video status?
Video is wonderful, audio status is good.
Okay, thank you. So the speaker and a little bit on the topic, just title, and Dr. Radhika can elaborate further on this. So this topic, nutritional psychiatry, the word itself is so catchy, I would say. And it reminded me of my days during my residence in PGI, when I can tell you the very first case in the advice I wrote medicine, and then I wrote the nutritional, and then the lifestyle changes, and the yoga, and then meditation. I can tell you, and I was told by my seniors, my teachers, okay, what is this? So people used to talk about haloperidol, clopidogrel, and at that time, because this is one area of the behavioral science, I think, nutritional psychiatry, the word has come all over these years, and especially in the last 1 decade, it has been a great focus on overall the mental and physical health. So Dr. Malek Dave is an expert. He's a person who has a keen interest in biological psychiatry, neuroscience, genetics, and he is a recipient of, I would say, Bombay Psychiatric Society Award, Dr. Anil Shah Award. He has wide publications, and he has been the past president of Bombay Psychiatric Association, and is heading one of the Society of IPS subcommittee. He is a person, I think we need to learn a great from him, how the role of a nutritional psychiatry. In my own personal experience, and in my more than 2 decades of practice, this has always been the focus of my protocol of treatment, to focus on diet, lifestyle change, and others, and even the assessment focusing on focus on these kind of a very basic parameters of iron, then hemoglobin, then calcium, and all these things. And this gives a lot of confidence onto the patients also. And this also gives us a window for the patients to be treated on the medication level as well. I think the topic is really very interesting. And like Dr. Sumit Mittal was saying, what we eat, that is what we actually think, we feel, and we believe, and we do. This is exactly what it's all about. So now I ask my co-chair, Dr. Radhika Reddy, to contribute her wisdom on this topic.
Yeah, good evening, all the faculty over here, and my namaskarams to Dr. Prasad Rao sir, and also Dr. Sunil Mittal, and my friend Ruksheda, and all other seniors and junior colleagues. Definitely, today's topic is a very interesting and mid of the hour topic, I believe, because we always advise not only the medicines, and along with that, we also tell each and every patient what to eat and what not to eat also nowadays. And it's quite apparent that we consume foods only for the energy supply to the body. It's not the same. It is not merely the supply of energy. The food does a lot to our body and also to our mind. So we all know that. So now it is a thing like the question is what to eat and what not to eat, and foods which we consume, and we need to tell even our patients also in a day-to-day basis, which helps them in certain diseases or illnesses, especially for well-being, mental well-being, and mental health, and like certain neurotransmitter producing or enhancing foods, and certain proteins which enhance the some amino acids like taurine or tryptophan, something like that, and probiotics like as Dr. Sunil Mittal already mentioned, which makes all the good and bad bacteria in the gut, which all again gives rise to inflammation. It's a chain sort of thing which gives a lot of damage to the system and also to the mind, producing depression and other things. So there is enough evidence to say that and to conclude also that what we eat and the foods which we consume has a lot to do. So there is enough evidence, but only thing is it is not in a systematic way. And a brief review by our speaker today will give us or enhance the knowledge regarding this, and I believe Dr. Malay Dave will enrich us with all these with the topic and all the points, relevant points in this topic. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, the IABP, the team. Thank you very much. Over to the speaker.
Thank you, IABP, for giving me this platform to talk on nutritional psychiatry, a critical review, and how we need to look at it as of 3rd December 2021, how it is going to inform our practice meaningfully. Thank you for the kind words, chairpersons, and I will share my screen now. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are
Yeah,
audible, and your slides are
okay.
visible. Slides are visible, Malay.
Okay. So, well, the topic for the day is nutritional psychiatry, critical review and clinical utility. I am Dr. Malay Dave, and I'll start. Just a small request to the chairpersons, please give me a warning bell, sign, shout, whatever you think fit at around 25 to 30 minutes, so that I'll finish on time, and then we can discuss, we can answer questions. So I'll begin now. As the old jungle saying goes, one human's food is another human's poison. And the first thing that we need to keep in mind, and we always need to keep in mind when we are dealing with nutrition, is this. So this is what I start with. I have no conflict of interest. I am not associated with any company which is making any nutritional related products. I'm not, nobody has approached me, no company that makes omega-3 fatty acids or anything like that. I'm not being paid for this topic. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to review the specialty. Nutrition psychiatry is an upcoming specialty, so to say, on these following topics. First of all, what is the concept of nutritional psychiatry? A brief look at what are the pathogenetic mechanisms that go into the making of a psychiatric illness. Various dietary molecules and their effects as we understand them now. What are some findings from research? What can be the clinical utility of nutritional psychiatry as of now? We'll look at omega-3 fatty acids, a brief overview, a very brief glance at omega-3 FAs. And of course, we'll talk about some limitations, what is the future, and a big caution when it comes to nutritional psychiatry. So coming to the concept of nutritional psychiatry, it's a rapidly evolving subspecialties or a subspecialty of psychiatry. And as Dr. Mittal mentioned, as Dr. G. Prasad Rao sir mentioned, that we seem to know everything about nutrition. It's like nutrition is as old as humanity. The problem is whether we have understood human beings properly. If you understand human beings properly, have you understood psychiatric illnesses properly? And if you have understood psychiatric illnesses properly, have you understood one aspect of human behavior, that is nutrition? But anyway, it's a rapidly developing specialty. Why? Because there are a number of intervention studies that are now available, which have looked at various components of nutrition as regards various psychiatric disorders. We have got a lot of preclinical and epidemiological data available, in the sense prevalences of psychiatric illnesses, and not only prevalences, but prevalences of dietary patterns and things like that. So what is basically the preamble of nutritional psychiatry? It is clinical consideration, where appropriate, of prescriptive dietary modification or improvement, and or the select judicious use of nutrient-based supplementation to prevent or manage psychiatric disorders. So there are three components. One is appropriate. Second is prescription. So it is going to be, or rather it's the aim of nutritional psychiatry that I should be able to write on my prescription, use this, use that, like I write, let's say tablet haloperidol 1115 mg, something like that. For the modification and improvement, yes, of course, that is what we are here for. Select judicious use of nutrient-based supplementation to prevent or manage psychiatric disorders. So it's not only to manage or treat, but also to prevent, if possible, psychiatric disorders. We all know that there is a huge burden of mental disorders. We'll not go into the figures because it's all, everybody knows there are all those charts and graphs which say that if you look at the global burden of disease or the DALEs, then in the top 5 disorders, there is always going to be depression and anxiety, along with another non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular diseases. The problem that we face as clinicians is that psychopharmacological research is pretty slow. And after all the big bang molecules that we found out by serendipity for clinical use 50, 60 years back, any development on that is slow. New targets, new neurotransmitter systems, and new things that can be possible targets in psychopharmacological research are also slow to find out. So we are kind of, we are on a golf cart course. We are not in an F1 speed, we are at a golf cart course. Yes, of course, we need modifiable targets, and modifiable targets are not necessarily symptoms, because we have done a lot of classifications, categorizations in terms of symptoms right from day one. And well, we are there. We don't have much more than that. Dietary prescriptions or dietary advice needs to be integrated with physical activity, exercise, regulation of sleep, that is circadian rhythm management, and several other health promotion activities. So it's not going to be only one when it comes to addition of things for the psychopharmacological management. This International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research, ISNPR, published an index paper in 2015, which actually set the ball rolling. So systematic studies in nutritional psychiatry are only about 6-7 years old. If when 2022 starts, it will be 7 years old. Like we say that at 7 years of age, there is a proper understanding of logical concepts. So probably will be more logical when 7 years are over. There is a shift according to ISNPR. There is a shift. Well, there should be a shift in thinking about what we eat. So towards a traditional whole food dietary pattern comprising higher intakes of foodstuffs such as vegetables, fruits, seafoods, whole grains, lean meat, nuts, and legumes. Well, they are saying this, but this is what is known. I mean, we go to any physician who is a non-psychiatrist physician, whether we go to a physician, a cardiologist, neurologist, they'll probably advise the same thing. We need to avoid processed foods, including trans fats and refined carbohydrates and sugars. And brain health requires macronutrients in addition to our regular stuff, critical cofactors and phytochemicals. So this is basically what is the standing of ISNPR in this last 6 or 7 years. Now, what are mechanisms of psychiatric illnesses or pathogenesis of psychiatric illnesses? We need to have just a look at it, because if we do not understand the disease processes, whatever we advise is not going to be enough, it's not going to be effective, and it's not going to be long lasting. Just looking at symptoms of psychiatric illness may not be enough for us to actually give a targeted specific nutritional prescription. So now, whether we look at the disease first, or that is basically the clinical presentations, or we look at the genome, that is the genes causing or associated with the production of a psychiatric illness, we need to look at all these factors. We need to look at, of course, the symptoms. We need to look at the environment. We need to look at the genome of an individual, that is what actually predisposes him to develop a psychiatric disorder in the first place. How and what are the epigenetic marks? How this actually leads to the development of neurocognitive traits, imaging phenotypes, metabolic traits, and finally the disease. Because if we assume that we know the disease, we also need to understand that we need to know all these things. And then, of course, we need to know how specific components of diet act at what levels and how this can be modified. This is a very simplistic model of what goes into the making of a psychiatric illness. A little bit more complex is something like this, that we have an interaction, that is the epigenome or genetic epistasis, stress factors working on that, all this kind of pathophysiological changes that are happening in terms of changes or dysregulation at circuitry levels, changes in system functioning, which is neuroendocrine, autonomic and immune dysfunctions, impact on cellular and subcellular levels in terms of intracellular signaling, gene transcription, neurotropic support. All this go together to make this symptoms of a psychiatric illness and systemic manifestations. One of the things that we need to actually focus on in our day-to-day practice, along with this, we focus on neuropsychiatric symptoms, yes, but we also need to focus on systemic manifestations, because psychiatric illnesses most of the time will have some more or less minor or major systemic symptoms, common as being GI symptoms along with anxiety. We need to look at the whole picture, because all this in the background goes into the making of a complete psychiatric illness. These things are laid down during development, and development happens on this basis. So when we look at a symptom profile, we are looking at a cross section. We are not looking at the process completely, and that is what we need to look at. So if you look at schizophrenia, again, it's basically the repetition of same thing. Genetic variants, environmental risk factors, there is an alteration in the molecular biology, the cellular biology, the circuit level biology, and this endophenotypes or patterns which are of cognition and behavior, and then a disorder happens as probably DSM-5 sees it. So when it's DSM-5, we are down somewhere, and we need to look at this. Again, I'm stressing, because if we do not look at this, we will not know what our diets are targeting, what are the active principles in the diet that need to be modified according to the disease. A similar one about depression, unipolar depression and ADHD. So what are the pathways mediating the diet mental health relationship? So there are several of them. One is inflammation, oxidative stress, neurotropic plasticity or neuroplasticity and neurodegeneration, mitochondrial dysfunction, gut-brain axis. Now these 5 are broad headings. Under each of them, there are numerous other ones. And we need to understand that these systems are not mutually exclusive, but all of them will work or not work together properly or interact properly to produce a disease. So we need to look at, as I mentioned, a lot of things that are genetic or epigenetic are at a molecular level, cellular level, at a circuit level, and systems level, these pathways, before we actually understand what is nutrition and how it is going to impact. Okay. The next thing is, what are the various dietary molecules that we know of and their effects? It's a pretty crowded or a complicated slide, so we're not going to go into any details. But what we now know, now let's say, for example, omega-3 fatty acids, everybody's favorite, it's being marketed for n number of things. So what does it do actually roughly? We are not going to go into micromolecular and things like that, but basic understanding of how omega-3 fatty acids work. They've got an effect on neurotransmission, neurogenesis, gene expression. It has got antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. And that makes it a potential molecule in the management of n number of disorders. Because if you look at the previous slides, as I mentioned, there are all those systems in place. Now, what we need to also understand is that all these systems, whether it's the inflammatory system, the immune system, and so on and so forth, they are not exclusive to any psychiatric disease. They are present, or rather functioning or dysfunctioning more or less in all psychiatric disorders. There's a considerable overlap, biologically speaking, between disorders. So because of all these actions, omega-3 fatty acids are considered potential molecules. When we look at diets like Mediterranean diets, now what does it do? It has an enhanced production. It leads to an enhanced production of BDF basically. And when it comes to psychiatry, it's supposed to protect against depression. Now this BDNF again is not specific. BDNF is associated with a lot of psychiatric disorders. It's a neurotropic factor. So neurotropic disturbances lead to a lot of developmental issues, lead to a lot of psychiatric symptoms, again, not specific to any psychiatric disorder. And Mediterranean diet is also not exclusive for psychiatric disturbances, psychiatric illnesses. Mediterranean diet has been prescribed for anything from weight loss to cardiovascular illnesses to neurodegenerative disorders, apart from psychiatric illnesses. So again, not specific. We look at probiotics. We know that there is a certain, we basically are living in partnership with a lot of microorganisms which are there in our gut. In fact, I have not put up that slide because it's not a purview of today's topic. More than 30% of the energy that we get from the diet that we take actually goes to feeding our gut bacteria. I mean, actually we live for them, so to say. Whatever we eat goes to them. If you give them a good diet, if you give them a good enriching environment, the good ones will flourish. If not, then they will not act and the bad ones will come to play. But what do these gut bacteria do? They are the first line of defense, in the sense they produce a lot of pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory molecules. They manage the cortisol HPA, the HPA cortisol response. They are associated with the production of a lot of neurotransmitters and so on and so forth. So that balance of proper bacterial species is needed, and that's why probiotics come into play. Now again, non-specific, but what people feel is that symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, depression may change when probiotics are given. We'll come to the research part later on. Then we have other principles in diet like hesperidin, which is a flavonoid, coca flavonoids. This basically, the flavonols, they have an effect on hippocampal functioning, so cognition, neurogenesis, and maybe an effect on cognitive impairment. So especially when it comes to stress-induced cognitive impairments, neurodegeneration-induced cognitive impairments, they can be of help. We have had St. John worts. We have got curcumin, green tea. Okay, again, they have got a lot of activity on various monoamine neurotransmission, on BDNF, anti-inflammatory effects, antioxidant effects, and of course, good old vitamin D, which is supposed to be neuroprotective. In a city like Mumbai, about 80% of the population is vitamin D deficient. So, well, it's supposed to be of great help. So this is basically an overview of some of the important components of diet, or certain constituents of diet, or certain nutritional compounds on which research has been done. This is what we know about how they act. This we know basically from small animal studies, small mammal studies, that this is their action, right? Now, how does it, when research is done on these molecules, on these compounds, on this nutrition components, what do we find? So what is the kind of research? This is a snapshot. I'm not going to include everything because there are just too many papers. So I have not even cherry picked, but I have kind of picked up references or points which cover the whole gamut of psychiatry. So we have got studies on maternal nutrition and the early life nutrition, which has got an effect on subsequent childhood mental health. These are kind of longitudinal studies, long-term studies, epidemiological studies. We have got studies where maternal macronutrient deficiencies during critical periods of pregnancy can be implicated in the pathogenesis of depressive and psychotic disorders in the offspring. So basically, we have got studies on maternal nutrition. We know that unhealthy dietary patterns are associated with poor mental health in children, adolescents, and adults. So this was a maternal perspective. This is a developmental perspective. Studies have said that early dietary intervention is a modifiable target because that is the time when in the period of development, we will have problems, the deficient or the defective immune functioning or metabolic functioning will be on and might lead to symptoms. So we need to put a break on that. Diets which can reduce depressive symptoms, association between healthy dietary patterns and a reduced risk and prevalence of symptoms such as depression. There is this European PREDIMED study which says that there's a reduced risk for incident depression in people with type 2 diabetes who were randomized to a Mediterranean diet with nuts compared with a low-fat diet control group. So basically, as I mentioned, when we are looking at any psychiatric disorder, it is important for us to also have a look at what other systems of the body are involved. So this is a study on type 2 diabetes. So basically a metabolic diagnosis along with a psychiatric diagnosis. How does this how does this pattern help? Basically a Mediterranean diet. What is this Mediterranean diet? No fat. So we'll have something like olive oil, lean meats, nuts, fresh vegetables, things like that. Then there is this mood food prevention study where patients with subsyndromal depressive symptoms and a history of depression have higher levels of emotional and uncontrolled eating and lower levels of cognitive restrained eating. So this is how we look at patterns of eating. Not only Mediterranean diet per se, but Mediterranean style diet. There are 2 trials in depression, HEALTHY-MED trial and a PREDIDEP trial. I'm not going to go into any details, but what they do is what are the claims coming out of these trials, that it improves the quality of life and mental health in people with depression. That is the HEALTHY-MED trial. And this PREDIDEP trial actually reduces relapses or recurrences. So Mediterranean diet, some change, plus minus, let's say HEALTHY-MED had omega-3 added to that, right? And here in this with Mediterranean diet, where there is classic olive oil, they use extra virgin olive oil. So, well, supposed to help one in the quality of life and second in recurrences. There is a wide range of nutrients which have been studied for mood disorders. Omega-3 fatty acids, as SAMI, NAC, zinc, B vitamins, including folate and vitamin B. Not many studies. Omega-3s in particular, EPA for major depressive disorders and bipolar depression to an extent, omega-3 EPA as an adjunctive treatment for MDD, tetramethylfolate for MDD, NAC in schizophrenia mood disorders. Now, in the last 2 years, there are studies which are like this. There is no significant association between adherence to the Mediterranean diet and risk of depression. Now, these are huge systematic reviews. All the previous studies have been included in this and a fresh perspective is obtained. That's why it becomes important, because we might have hundreds of studies which are done on small populations, small period of time, with this particular kind of diet. But when you pull it all together, we need to pull it all together because we need to give good advice to our patients. What has worked in one of my patients might not work in the other because of that first statement I made, which is that old jungle saying. So we need to have good base, and this base comes from systematic meta-analysis or reviews. And one of these, a 2019 review says that there is no significant association between a Mediterranean diet and risk for depression. So what we looked at 2 slides back, we need to reevaluate. We know of the ketogenic diet in epilepsy, but apart from epilepsy, the ketogenic diet has been recommended for n number of things, including weight loss. So, well, it does work for epilepsy, but I'm not sure whether it works for anything else. I didn't find so much of data otherwise. Of course, deficiencies, we know B12 deficiency, folate deficiency, niacin deficiency, vitamin D. Well, you supplement it and it works, but we are not looking at that per se, because we are looking at psychiatric disorders as we understand them. Vitamin D, unfortunately or fortunately, plenty of studies but conflicting results. So if you ask me whether I'm going to write vitamin D in all my patients' prescriptions for any disorder, no, not at all. Because in spite of having so many hundreds of studies, it is still inconclusive whether it is a recommended approach. There's a whole list of studies on some of those components which I mentioned on polyphenols, PUFAs, supplements, effects on mental health, cognitive, broad-based studies, nothing specific about a psychiatric disorders. So all of these are in studies individually have had a good effect. Another thing when it comes to child and adolescent psychiatry are a few studies which are there on elimination of food additives. As foods, in today's times, as we eat more and more refined foods or processed foods, there are going to be a lot of additives, preservatives and things like that, which are used in the mechanism of food processing. And if they're eliminated, some studies in ADHD have found that in about 30 to 40% of children, there is some symptomatic improvement. Supplementation of free fatty acids has been associated with a small but reliable reduction in ADHD symptoms. Micronutrient supplementation has also been associated with some symptomatic improvement. Diet high in refined sugar and saturated fat may manifest as an increased risk for ADHD or hyperactivity. This is about ADHD. But when it comes to ASD, because these are two disorders which have been widely subjected to a lot of nutritional research, with ASD, nothing is conclusive. Not even as little bit conclusive as what these few studies have mentioned about ADHD improvement. With autism, it is very diverse. Even this, there have been no rigorous meta-analysis till about 2 or 3 years back. So when we have a broad picture of what kind of studies are there, we have got some idea that what maternal nutrition, good nutrition is important. Good nutrition in childhood and adolescent is important. Certain kinds of diet like the Mediterranean diet and some modifications might be helpful for depression, at least, along with systemic illnesses. Deficiencies need to be looked into. Yes. For disorders which are more neurodevelopmental in origin like ADHD and ASD, reduction in food additives, reduction in processed foods, refined foods and all, maybe it will help. Right? This is where we stand. Now, research is fine. Even I can do some clinical research, but how is it going to be utilized? Now, what do we get from all these things? These are what I mentioned are the broad points, but how and when will it be useful? First of all, we need to understand this concept of biomarkers. Means what? That if we are only going to look at symptoms, we are going to come to a dead end very fast. Those are targets to an extent, but unless and until we focus on the mechanisms of the illness, the pathogenetic factors in the illness, we are not going to have long-term sustained kind of effects, whether it is psychopharmacology, whether it is nutrition. So what are these biomarkers? Roughly speaking, they are objective markers or objective points which are measurable. Okay. And when I get a biomarker of a disease, and if I'm doing something, I'm intervening, that there should be a noticeable change in the biomarker. So biomarkers will tell me whether the disease is improving or not. Biomarkers will tell me whether the person is responding or not to a certain something. Biomarkers can also tell me whether if this is present or this is absent, what is going to be the outcome of the illness. Roughly. So there are numerous biomarkers. Brain imaging biomarkers, biomarkers of inflammation, neurotransmitter related biomarkers, neurotropic or something like BDNF markers, electrophysiological EEG related markers, gut microbiota biomarkers and things like that. So there are so many. Now, unfortunately, the way we are looking at psychiatric illnesses right now, we do not have a single specific biomarker for a single specific psychiatric disease. We may have got certain biomarkers which are processes. So we might have, let's say, if you look at inflammatory biomarkers, increase in interleukin 6 or increase in CRP. Now, inflammatory biomarkers, yes. Specific to a disease, no. Let's say we look at hypercortisolemia. Yes, happens in a lot of processes, processing of stress. Found in which particular disorder? None, but many. So we have got this kind of biomarkers. Now we'll look at simple something, brain imaging. Atrophy of the brain, does it happen only in dementia? No, it can happen in n number of things. Specificity, no. Something is happening, yes. So if I am able to track it, let's say every 5 years I do an MRI and see it's progressing, then it is a marker of neurodegeneration. Of anything specific, maybe no. So in absence of biomarkers, it becomes difficult to target. Now, suppose somebody comes to me with schizophrenia, and let's say I am able to do, let's say I do a CRP, it comes okay. Now it is supposed to be a biomarker for schizophrenia, but it is okay. So in this patient, is it important? May not be important. So if I am going to give something that is going to reduce the inflammation, will it work? May not work, because because the specific marker is not present. Inflammation doesn't seem to be there. Of course, there are 20 others, but this is a theoretical example. If I'm looking at BDNF levels, for example, now BDNF levels reduce with every episode of a bipolar disorder. So whether it is mania, depression, it reduces. And if it goes on reducing after a certain point in time, the levels are less. But does it happen in all bipolar patients? No. So suppose I have a patient who has got a normal BDNF level, if I'm able to measure it. If I am having something like this, will it be logical to use something that is going to increase BDNF levels? Maybe no. So in absence of reliable biomarkers, selection of a specific nutraceutical and specific compound or a molecule is difficult. Why? Because few slides back when we saw that diagram of so many active components, omega-3 fatty acids work on this works on that, right? If we are not able to match this with that, we might not be getting a good response, or we might not be actually serving the purpose with what we started out. So we need to have a complete assessment. This is again important. For our intervention to be meaningful, we need to have this all kinds of biomarkers, neuroimaging, omics, so pharmacogenomics, right? Inflammatory markers. Now, what was missed out in the previous slide is we need to have a proper nutrient profile. That is where the problem is. We ask people, what do you eat? And most people will not give us a correct answer. Most of them. That is where the drawback is. We have no objective way of assessing the nutritional state. I mean, of course, when we look at people, we know that they are not malnourished or they are not wasted or things like that. Or if there's an obvious vitamin deficiency, fine. But apart from that, we are not able to assess anything if we ask them. So even assessing nutrition or nutritional status is a very subjective thing. We give them a chart, what do you eat in the morning, what do you eat in the afternoon, what do you eat at night, what do you snack, what are your cheat days, what do you do this, what do you do. It is all subject to a lot of bias, lot of falsifications. We do not get an exact overview or a clear-cut understanding of what is happening. So we need to do something about it. We need to understand it. If we have got certain specific measures for assessing the nutritional status, fine. So where are we moving actually? If we want to make, if we make a group clinical assessment, if we have all these markers in place, then things will be utilized. Second thing is this last line. Where are we right now? We have got some epidemiological studies. That is what we got from research. We have some experiments that are done. Again, we have that in research. Do we have good quality clinical trials? No. So then where are we faltering in our clinical assessment? One. Here, because we are not really getting at the basis of psychiatric disorders. 2, 3. To be clinically meaningful, if all these things are in place, then what we say is that we have reached from basic neuroscience to a translatable clinical approach. Just to make things a little bit more clear, we have got the maximum data on omega-3 fatty acids. So I thought that at a glance, let's see what is the status of omega-3 fatty acids. So this International Society for Nutrition Psychiatry Research has got some guidelines, okay, published about 2 years back. So it is about when do we use omega-3 fatty acids, where do we use omega-3 fatty acids, how do we use omega-3 fatty acids, what do we look for when we use omega-3 fatty acids. So a detailed clinical interview is needed to rule out hypersensitivity because it's a fish related product. Of course, there are vegetarian sources also, but basically hypersensitivity needs to be asked. It is recommended as an adjunctive treatment for adult MDD, not a solo treatment. Adjunctive at all times. It is efficacious and safe, supposedly, both for acceleration and augmentation. Acceleration is when you start around, let's say, with an SSRI from day one, or augment when we find that it is not improving and we need to add something. We need to use EPA mainly. The most active, effective component is EPA, that is eicosapentaenoic acid, or a ratio of EPA or DHA, that is docosahexaenoic acid, in a ratio of more than 2:1. So basically, EPA has to be more, whether we use it single or whether we use in a combination. More evidence is needed for recurrent depression. So if a patient is coming to me for the first time, maybe, but as an adjunct, when it's recurrent, no. What is the dose regimen? 1 to 2 grams of day of total EPA. Okay, from pure EPA or from this combination. So we start with 1, titrate maximum dose up to 2. That is what is the recommendation. If it's not responding, we don't know what to do. We evaluate the quality of these products, but I don't know how do we assess the quality. We have to actually just look and use whatever is available to us. So for non-responders, again, we are stuck. Their recommendation is also that's the potential prophylactic treatment for high risk population, but along with treatment as usual. No, it's not an solo treatment. The duration may be extended. For how much, we don't know. We need to monitor adverse effects, especially for those who are receiving a higher dose. Specific populations that need to be kept in mind is MDD patients who are overweight or have inflated or have elevated levels of inflammatory markers. So this is where it will work. Because omega-3 fatty acids are supposed to be anti-inflammatory. Women with perinatal major depressive disorder, elderly, children, adolescents, basically everybody who has got MDD, first episode may be useful. This is what they recommend. Who recommends? International Society for Nutrition Psychiatry Research, omega-3 fatty acids. Potential side effects: gastrointestinal, dermatological, biochemical. You are giving a fatty acid, so higher level of low density lipoprotein, increasing fasting BS. So basically, as metabolic effects. These are the supposedly the common side effects, which are not supposed to be that great. This was till 2019. This was when the recommendation came. Now, there are other studies which are going hand in hand with the recommendations by the ISNPR, and what they say. Long-term PUFA supplementation may be associated with increased cancer risk because of their oxidation products, because fats, lipids will get oxidized over time, and added vitamin E. Omega-3 PUFAs are highly prone to oxidative degradation, so it will add to this burden. Okay, so it can either this oxidation will make them ineffective or harmful. So back to point 1. The oil content in omega-3 supplements may contain a mixture of other omega-3 PUFAs, problematic additives, so we don't know what happens. And the health consequences of oxidized fish oil. They are talking about fish oil, but we also need to look at what goes into processing that vegetable sources or plant sources to omega-3 fatty acid, which is taken for treatment. So basic idea is that the previous list of side effects are more acute, short term. But if it is continued, then we need to be on the watch out for something like increased cancer risk. So that becomes a problematic point. We don't know, because frankly speaking, if I need to put on weight, if I'm going to overeat for 6 months, I might not really put on weight or go into that obese category. And the same thing happens is when I diet, I'm not going to lose weight so fast. What I'm trying to say is that dietary modifications for anything takes a very long time. probably takes a time longer than our conventional pharmacotherapeutic agents also. That is what we need to keep in mind. So even though some effects of omega-3 fatty acids will be visible in the shorter period of time, problematic ones like this will take a long period to unfold or manifest. Okay. This is from JAMA, March 2021. What do they say? There may be a dose-related risk of atrial fibrillation with omega-3 fatty acids. Now, again, this they are saying because there are 4 major studies where they have used omega-3 fatty acids for various types of cardiovascular disorders. So patients are on treatment for that, and people are on omega-3 fatty acids up to 4 grams per day. So for us, it was 1 to 2. They've used higher doses. So at 4, double the risk of atrial fibrillation with intermediate doses. So probably here, it did not achieve statistical significance, but there was an increase in the risk. So again, this doesn't come overnight. So I wonder if some of us who are really scared about giving quetiapine 25 mg to patients because that might increase the QTc interval, predispose a patient to TDP or misbeats or AF, we should be worried about this because this will come silently over a period of time, maybe not right on day 1. So those who are on higher doses need to be monitored for this. So with this, what is the recommendation? That was IS NPR, but we are more concerned about our guidelines. So this is basically a recommendation from the CANMET 2016 guidelines for mood disorders, and they have given it mild to moderate MDD second line as monotherapy or adjunctive. Mild, moderate to severe second line, level 2 adjunctive. But this is 2016, and all those other things have come in 2019. Right. So again, what other things? There is always a flip side to what is actually our line of thinking. And this is whatever meta-analyses are there have a lot of publication bias, a lot of heterogeneity, methodological shortcomings. People have not used the same uniform formulations. Okay, there are problems in blinding. There is minimal evidence in other psychiatric disorders. So the current recommendation of certain authorities is relook at the guidelines, especially when a lot of this cardiovascular data is coming up. Okay, and this is the last one, which is a Cochrane review. Now, when it comes to Cochrane, then we say that, well, we accept this. There is no breaking our head further with Cochrane because these are the most done, most procedurally correct meta-analysis or reviews that are done. So no sufficient high certainty evidence to determine effects as a treatment. Small to modest, non-clinically beneficial effect. Okay. What is the estimate? Difficult to judge. Compared to antidepressants, the effects are imprecise and uncertain, and more complete evidence. Usually Cochrane reviews end up like that. So if we are going to use it, then we have to keep Cochrane in mind because this is the latest. If something else comes in 2022, and if you're discussing again, maybe that should be our starting point for prescribing therapies based on omega-3 fatty acids. The last section of my talk is about things which are limitations, the future, and this big red caution. Well, what is the limitation? First is whatever we have is mixed results, and mixed results make up for poor evidence. I'll give a study which is this, and maybe while we are discussing, somebody will give me a study which is otherwise. So what is the sum total? We are not sure. So evidence is poor. A lot of these studies, almost all of them, have got a large placebo effect. Right? When you say, oh, we are giving omega-3 fatty acids, and somebody would have heard of omega-3 fatty acids and say, fine, now I'm going to get well. That's a placebo effect. To reduce the placebo effect is really problematic when it comes to nutrition studies. Some people, going back to the diagram where there are so many chemicals that we know have got so many activities, why not combine them all? In fact, newer studies where they have combined nutraceuticals, they are saying that more is not better than one. There are design limitations, so we do not have longitudinal studies. So, side effect wise and all, we need to be very clear. Assessment quality, as I mentioned, clinically also, people will say, it's difficult for them to even say what they've had for breakfast today. What details are they going to give me about their nutritional intake? There's an expectancy bias. There are blinding issues. How are we going to blind them? And of course, in disorders like ASD or for that matter, any psychiatric disorder, the findings are so diverse. The symptomatological patterns are so diverse. People are so diverse, patients are so diverse. Even in the same family, people like to eat different things. So diversity becomes a big problem to make sense of studies. So what is the future direction? Well, we need continued research in proper design studies for all severe psychiatric illnesses, not for mild depression or mild anxiety, or proper severe ones. We need to look at the gut microbiome in detail. I have not touched it one bit apart from what gut microbes are and what do they do. But gut microbe biota dysbiosis is implicated as an etiological factor in almost all psychiatric disorders. So we need to really understand what is happening. Probiotic supplementation, well, as I said, the first thing is there that one man's food is another's poison. Curds don't work. Yogurt doesn't work for everybody equally. If somebody is allergic to a probiotic, then there will be a problem. So even probiotics is not as simple as taking a yogurt, bowl of yogurt every day. It has to be what we call as personalized, a part of personalized psychiatric treatment. So unless we identify the biomarker, there's something wrong in my gut bacteria, then the curds might help. And what kind of curds, what strains it should have is altogether another matter. A word of caution before I end. Well, nutraceuticals is a booming industry, right? There are many players in the market, and the nutraceutical market is much more so to say many more times bigger than the pharmaceutical industry. So it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of pressure when we talk about or when we introduce nutraceuticals as treatment modalities. A lot of press, everybody jumps, and when everybody jumps, everything is a superfood or strictly to be avoided. Somebody will talk about idlis, and next day on, idlis are the superfood. So everybody will start, whether they have a kind of an allergic response or a prophylactic response to fermented foods, people will eat. That is the role of the press. Studies are not really interpreted well by the press folks. So is social media. Open up Instagram and you'll see so many diets, so many people doing so many diets with all attractive pictures, and you get a six-pack and stuff like that, and then you are mentally in heaven, that kind of stuff. And everybody writes a book on whatever they do. So more than research papers, there are books on diets. Now, all this has to be taken with a lot of salt, not a pinch, a lot of salt. Traditionally, research on nutrition, as we understand now, is really not on track. And when we are talking about nutrition in psychiatry, we are nowhere near the track. Forget being on track. So with this in mind, thank you so much for your patience, and I hand over the proceedings to the chairpersons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Malay, for a really excellent presentation and very in-depth knowledge, I would say. And in fact, this is something which we probably most of us must be hearing for the first time. Now I invite Dr. Jagdisha for his expert comment on this topic. Sir, your voice is not set clear.
Am I audible now?
Yes, better now.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Dr.
Sir, you are logged in from 2 devices, I think.
That's why I'm closing one. I had kept it to one. Yes. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks to Dr. Pramod Kumar. It's an excellent presentation by Dr. Malay Dave. Probably he has not left any room for any discussion. Nutritional psychiatry is in the nascent stage. As Dr. Prasad Rao and as well as Dr. Malay Dave said, both is $1 million industry. people are carried away by the press and other things. The last slide speaks about it. But before that, we need to understand few things before we discard that hypothesis. Inflammation plays a vital role in the neuropsychiatric disorders. Dietary factors play a role in that inflammatory hypothesis. Antioxidants help to a certain extent in bringing down the inflammatory thing. That is how the interest in nutritional psychiatry started in psychiatry, in all the neuropsychiatric illnesses. So multiple supplements have shown small improvement in stress, anxiety, depression, as well as in cognitive decline. Why is it so? There's a rich innervation of GI system, innervation of GI system might deliver impulses and singularly to the brain in addition to receive them. So probably gut microbiota plays a vital role. Apart from this, there is a circadian. Probably at this juncture, as Dr. Malay Dave presented, supplementing with a nutraceutical may not be a very ideal situation, except burning the pockets of our patients. So can we use nutritional supplement as an adjuvant to the existing things? For example, whenever a psychiatric patient comes, we say medication, exercise, schedule of activity, family environment. Similarly, can some changes in the diet can benefit, because there is very little evidence. Mediterranean diet and depression, Mediterranean diet during pregnancy improving sleep, especially the first study of mocha coffee improving cognition and mood, all have very little evidence for that. So instead of thinking of nutraceutical, can we think about a balanced diet, which is becoming a part of all the diseases, especially metabolic syndrome? Because most of our tablets of medication also can induce metabolic syndrome. So in that context, diet also plays a vital role. So we, along with diet, doesn't mean that fasting, losing weight, etc. Can we make them to understand what nutrition can benefit? For example, we are all aware of it. Folate, B12, D, vitamin B1, B6, all play a role in our psychological illnesses to a small extent. They need not be therapeutically very significant. So today's discussion was an eye-opener for two things. One, a commercial nutraceutical is not an answer, or today we don't have enough evidence to say that should become a part of our prescription. It's except burning the holes up in our patients, nothing else. Second, can we look into a balance, the diet related to that can benefit? For example, they say fruits, vegetables, nuts. It boils down to Mediterranean diet, which helps in depression. Similarly, they say certain things will, keto diet will benefit. One study says keto diet benefits in anxiety management. How much? Probably very little. So today, what we need to do at the end of the day is we need a better understanding of diet and my mental health. Future studies should fill in the gap between epidemiological studies and clinical evidence for the prevention of mental health and through the dietary things. For example, vitamin D, B12, all are important. But subclinically, if patient has lower levels of B12 and D3, is it causing any mental illness? We don't know. Only thing, patients who come to us, when we assess, they may be having that. So in that context, a wider study is required. Probably we need more evidence, but at this, because this nutritional psychiatry is in a nascent stage, so we need to keep our mind open. Can this become an adjuvant in counseling our patients in some of the illnesses? With this, I have to give full points to Dr. Dave for making this very simple and educative. So let us be very careful before we prescribe any nutraceutical to our patient. Adding, understanding some diet which can benefit in depression, anxiety, ADHD, elderly, probably maybe a little beneficial in most of our patients as an adjuvant. With this, I'm extremely thankful for Indian Association of Biological Psychiatry for giving me an opportunity to share few of my words, because it was a very exhaustive and a comprehensive talk by Dr. Malay Dave. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Radhika, there are few questions in the chat.
Yes.
So can you take up?
Yeah. Sir, most of the messages are appreciative messages, many of them.
Thank you,
Sir,
everyone.
that was an excellent talk and a very comprehensive talk. And there was a question like, what is your input on orthomolecular psychiatry? Is one question. And one more thing is,
Right. So I'll
you can answer
so
that first.
orthomolecular psychiatry. I'm audible.
Yes.
Orthomolecular psychiatry, use of high doses of vitamins and all. I learned about it when I was a resident, and at that time, the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry had mentioned that, well, it is only orthomolecular psychiatry and it doesn't lead to anything much. So then I didn't learn about it. So I don't think I have any input on orthomolecular psychiatry, apart from the fact that all psychiatric disorders have nothing much to do with any kinds of vitamins. They're not vitamin deficiency disorders. If there is no vitamin deficiency, if we add a lot of vitamins, if there's no deficiency, there's no deficiency. But the problem is that vitamins can also lead to something called as hypervitaminosis states, which have their own set of problems, physical and psychiatric. So, for things like this, I'm actually very scared, and I go by the principle of primum non nocere. So first, do no harm. So orthomolecular, this thing is for me relegated to history of psychiatry, good to understand, good to know, and then not to practice. So something like that. That's my input.
Yeah, the next question is there any news about any certified biomarker testing for affective disorders, mood disorders?
So
there's a word from USA.
There is no certified biomarker testing. What Dr. Deva is referring to is basically a study done by University of Minneapolis, where they looked at all possible markers, biomarkers, whether it is genetic biomarkers, inflammatory biomarkers, phenotypic biomarkers, and then they associated everything with everything. And basic idea was to personalize psychiatry for an individual patient as much as possible. Having said that, it is still a research paper. It is not translated into something which you or me can write CBC, blood sugar fasting postman. It's not like that. It was a study, I think, done on about 300 patients, and it's only 300 patients. And if you're looking at genomic studies, it was only done on probably white Caucasians. Those norms, genomic norms, the genomic data is much different for different populations of South Asian ancestry compared to the Caucasian ancestry. So we say, yes, they are on track. Let's see what more comes out of it, as 300 is not a large number. They need to, of course, even if it's a good thing, they'll need to undergo a lot of further testing on different populations, different centers. They have to get approvals. This was early this year, so it's just about 4 or 5 months before. So I'm not actually pinning my hopes on this for the next 5 years. Let us see what comes out of it.
Right. There's one more question. Any patient, does he require any nutritional supplement if he is on balanced diet? Do you think it's appropriate?
See, now there are two things to that. If you are on a balanced diet, you don't need anything if you're physically healthy. Matter ends there. Now, if you are healthy, doesn't mean that everything inside is fine. It means there are no external symptoms. What we are talking of today, what is the bottom line of today's this thing is everybody's genetics is different.
Yes.
Genetics determines a lot of things, including our symptoms of what we are going to present. If you're not going to present, for example, let's say my father had dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, when he was 75. So the commonest gene that actually is associated is ApoE4. Will I have it? Yes, I have ApoE4 now. I am 51 now. What does it mean? Will I have dementia? I don't know. Do I have it? No. Am I healthy? Yes. Am I going to remain healthy? No. What is the diet going to do? I don't know. Okay. Now, if I knew
Yes.
that ApoE4 is associated with what happens to the amyloid biology, if I have something on that, whether it's a nutraceutical or some pharmacotherapeutic agent, which definitely cuts down the activity of ApoE4, then maybe that. So it's actually a very vague thing. If you look at somebody and is healthy, doesn't mean that all the processes inside that are happening in the brain and other systems are fine. They're genetically determined. And what actually goes on wrong in what particular individual and when that individual can manifest as having psychiatric symptoms, it's a very difficult thing to say. So the answer is, if he's happy with his diet now, fine. If something happens, we'll see. Keeping the current state of affairs in mind.
So another question regarding sexual dysfunction. Did you come across any efficacy trials having nutraceuticals for marketed for sexual dysfunction?
No, not at all. In fact, I was surprised that in this whole gamut of going through so many systematic reviews and papers and things like that, nobody mentioned anything about sexual dysfunction. So again, I am tempted to believe that there would be studies on small things, small populations on certain specific things. Actually, what are they looking for? If they're looking for erectile dysfunction, again, that's a broad thing. It's not one etiology, which is, in fact, it's a presenting symptom of not many things associated with psychiatric disturbances, associated with psychiatric medications, associated with a lot of endocrine functioning. So very difficult to say, but no nutraceutical advice for any patient with sexual dysfunction.
Those are the questions, and put to an end. That was really an excellent presentation, Dr. Malay. And the final conclusion probably is we have to look for positive mental health, and the diet definitely has a role in that. And so we can eat and we can advise our patients also, which can be taken so that they have a good mental health. So we need not give any nutraceutical or any supplements and burn their pockets, as Dr. Jagadisha told us. Thank you very much, Dr. Malay.
Thank you.
Dr. Radhika, there is one more question which I'm going to say. It came up just recently.
Yes.
And that question is a role of maternal nutrition on the child mental health. This is the question. So
yes.
So we have certain longitudinal studies, and the overall thing is maternal nutrition has to be good. Now, the immediate benefits are good maternal nutrition is good antenatal health. So maybe there is good intrauterine milieu for the developing fetus. So probably things are in place. So when the child is born, there are no pregnancy-related complications. There are no developmental issues and things like that. Now, having said that, what are the components that go into a good pre-pregnancy, antenatal, postnatal period? Are a lot of things, including the gut microbiome in the mother, the gut microbiome that develops in the fetus. So it's not that only after birth the fetus develops a gut microbiome. It is there from day one. In fact, there is a large share of gut microbes that are transferred via the amniotic fluid into the child. This is just an example. Epigenetic modifications or presentations of marks are there right from conception. So what does it actually do? Apart from overall good physical health, apparently, as I said, there are a lot of these things that we need to consider. Now, suppose we have got certain studies. So when we have these studies, what are you looking at? You're looking at an endpoint when somebody develops a psychiatric, let's say ADHD, for example. Now, we need to wait for that ADHD to happen to successfully conclude that whether this maternal nutrition helped or not. Fine, studies are there like that. What I'm interested in is, why should we wait till then? What if we have studies which have got all these biomarkers as we understand, let's say with reference to ADHD or ASD, this is fictional, science fiction. So if we have these biomarkers, why will I not have a intrauterine kind of assessment only? And figure out that this is what is leading to it. Modify the diet accordingly. So not only the mother's health obviously remains okay, but then the factors that are going into the genesis of ASD, which is going to manifest on day one of birth, whether anything is going to block that. That is the kind of studies we need. That is a whole area which has been started with longitudinal studies like this. But once we have that in place, then we need to look finer.
Thank you, Dr. Malay. And that is the end of all the questions now. And I thank my co-chair, the organizers, and the expert comment, Dr. Jagdisha. And now I hand it over to Dr. Uksheda for rest of
the with the chair's permission, can I ask one question?
Sure, sir.
To Malay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, see, as usual, you're clear on a lot of things, but I still have one or two specific comments, I would say, not questions.
Yes,
the CANMAT guidelines usually depends on evidence. And they have recommended, as you put it, for mild to moderate depression. Especially, I'm just taking one or two examples, of course, SAMI and all. See, and we also know in a drug research, placebo response for antidepressants is around 35 to 55%. So in order to be efficacious for a nutraceutical product as an add-on, you need to have so much higher response. Now, that is more of an observation based on the evidence from the drug trials. My own second comment would be on, see, ADHD is probably the most battered one in terms of nutritional research. There were so many, if you go to our patients daily, I think I spend at least 10, 15 minutes talking to our relatives, saying whether this can be eaten, not that can be eaten, that Google says this. So I just want your final comment on the last part. The first part, of course, is my comment. You can react to that. The second comment is more important from a practical clinician point of view, especially a lot of psychiatrists are here. So do you say ADHD, for example? Definitely. And maybe I'll touch on another sensitive point is the second is of course, which you covered in your presentation also, autistic spectrum disorder. What are the things to be given and not to be given?
So first thing about the studies, yes, there is a large component of placebo response in any drug studies, and much more than that in nutritional research. So what happens is that evidence is based on very good randomized controlled trials. Even if it is one high quality RCT, it is good enough as evidence. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of thing. Very few such randomized control studies are there. But RCT is basically the rigor for anything that is going to be a treatment modality, because unless and until it is rigorous, tested, thrown out, accepted, rejected, whatever, it should not make the cut. Because otherwise, we are not really doing justice to our scientific temper. That is one. So yes, we need to have well-designed studies which will take into account that something like this happens, and then go about better studies. First one. Second thing is what I advise about diet. In fact, I see a lot of patients with autism, and parents sometimes they bring huge lists, foolscap sheets. This, I have tried this diet, this diet, this diet, this diet. The question is, you don't try out diets like that. So this thing is only very simple, very common sense. I first of all say I don't prescribe any diet unless your child has a documented deficiency of something, gluten sensitivity, then maybe. Just to give an example, I had a child and the mother said that no, we want to try a gluten-free diet. I said, don't try. As it is, your child is very lean, not eating, changing diet may not really work, but no, I want to try. They went to a dietitian, the dietitian said, okay, we'll try. And for 1 month, the child had very poor diet. He lost a lot of weight and became more cranky. Why? Because wheat was stopped. Gluten free. Doesn't work. So my advice is don't go for any fat diets. In fact, the largest number of diets are associated are there in the field of autism. So I start with a big red right from the first diet. Unless documented deficiency, don't do anything. But having said that, I tell them try and avoid just the simpler things. Less of outside food, less of junk, less of colas, less of chocolates, less of cookies, pizzas. I say less. I don't put a cross. Because if the children are finicky about something, once in a while is fine. Because if we are so rigid about our diets, then we should not attend any conferences because everything goes for a toss in those 4 days. So yeah, some infrequent chocolate can be given or something, but try and be as infrequent as possible. So that is my general advice. No specific diets to be followed unless documented. That is the only thing. There are people who will come and say, doctor, in the morning, I didn't give a chapati today. So till afternoon, the child was able to sit well in school, not hyperactive. But this is 1 day's observation. Does it mean that ADHD is improved as a disorder? Difficult to say. So as of now, for children, very simple common sense thing, avoid junk. That's all. Whatever comes in junk. And if they don't understand, I said whatever comes in a packet form, try and avoid as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now I request Dr. Abdul Bajid to propose vote of thanks.
Unmute, Majid.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Pramod Kumar sir. It's always a privilege to listen to Dr. Malay Dave, and with his all expertise and a lot of experience behind him, particularly in the research arena and clinical arena. He makes this thing so simple to assimilate and to understand. And this was obviously summarized so nicely by Dr. A. Jagdish, who summarized it beautifully, that we need to be very cautious giving these nutritional supplements to each and every patient. So we have to basically see exactly which one is suitable for it, where to use it and where not to use it. Then we had an interactive session made in this online CME series by the expert chairpersons. We had Dr. Pramod Kumar from Chandigarh and Professor Radhika Reddy from Vijayawada. And this CME could not have been possible without the office bearers of IABP, Dr. UC Garg, who is the president, Dr. Sunil Mittal, vice president, Dr. Pramod Kumar, who is chairperson, as well as vice president of IABP, and Dr. Akshida, who opened the innings actually today, and our treasurer Prasanjit, and most important to me, Dr. G. Prasad Rao, my big brother, who is the chief of CMEs all over the place, and particularly for IABP, he is the chair of scientific committee, and Dr. Aleem Siddiqui, who is the editor. Thank you all, and particularly all the participants who took very active part in today's session. We'll see you again very soon on the first Friday CME series of IABP. Thank you very much. Good evening, and take a good rest and take balanced and nutritious diet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.